Well, Daniel 1, verses 1 and 2 will be primary in our attention this morning. My goal is simple. If you're wondering how it is that we came to Daniel, what I'd like to do over the next several weeks, along with my colleagues, is to hear God's word through this ancient prophet and apply it to at least some of the varieties of anxiety or discouragement or even disillusionment that some of us feel, or maybe that many of us feel at this moment in our nation's political season, at this moment in U.S. history, at this moment in the lives of Jesus' followers living at this point. It's a frequent topic of conversation. It's one that is often on the agenda in our home. Because we set an agenda for what we talk about. But I'm sure that as you talk and you try to figure out how do we get through this season, it's something that is on your mind too. I know a lot of you ask me questions about it. I know that some of us are very concerned for the right candidate, whichever candidate it would be, to prevail, and you're anxious about what happens if your preferred candidate loses, or you're anxious about what happens if your preferred candidate wins. What if the resulting presidency is not what you hope it will be? Some of us are perhaps discouraged because of our choices. Some of us are discouraged because of political divisions that have caused relationships to fray. Those relationships might be fraying at home. Sometimes those relationships are fraying within the church world. Friends who are in the grandparent generation, at least in my life, describe sadness that grandchildren are growing up in a different America than the one that they grew up in. Parents wonder if the good old days that we hear about were so very good after all, and children are thinking, well, this is normal. What is the fuss about? And through it all, many of Jesus' followers ponder what living faithfully in our society in this current moment looks like. What does it look like to follow Jesus in this moment, particularly in a society that has moved away from God's will on critical issues? Just if you think about what is in our social discourse, moving away from the basic dignity of humans as body-soul unities made to bear God's image, moving away from the essential nature of marriage between one man and one woman for a lifetime, of the privilege of nurturing human life from conception onward, the propriety of using words to tell the truth and to promote the good name of our neighbors, of creating gifts and talents, of using creative gifts and talents to steward creation, the created world that God has made for our good and also for its good, of the honorability of governance and of government service to promote order, to establish justice. I could go on. All of these basic applications of God's will for human flourishing really up for grabs in our current cultural moment. And that won't be of any particular surprise to you. But how do we live in this space? It's a challenge. Listen, I will tell you a story that's true from a deep place of my heart, and I realize that this will sound cheesy to at least some of you, but bear with me. It's a true story. When I deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, the way that our regulations worked at that point in time was that soldiers did not wear the U.S. flag on our uniforms while we were still in country. We put them on our uniforms when we arrived overseas. And so there was a moment in Afghanistan where they gave us our desert uniforms that had the U.S. flag on it. And I can just tell you it was true for me that I felt very proud to wear the flag on my uniform on behalf of my friends and neighbors in harm's way. And that came from a deep place in my heart. And I mention that because I've had conversations with Christians about politics and worldview over the years where I've actually been told that I don't love America because of of just holding different beliefs than some other folks in church culture world. But what I've tried to communicate, and what I'm trying to even, I think, communicate now as I tell that story, is that as much as we love our nation, Christians hold dual citizenship. We hold dual citizenship in the homeland in which God has placed us, whether it's the United States of America or the United Kingdom or some other place. And we are citizens of the eternal homeland to which He calls us by faith. And the dual citizenship that we hold is relative in that way, right? Because the dual citizenship in this homeland is subordinate to the citizenship in that homeland. Paul says in Philippians 3 that our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So as we think about things related to citizenship in our earthly homeland is subordinate to citizenship in God's forever kingdom. And citizenships are sometimes going to align easily, and sometimes they're going to compete with each other. And I suspect that at least some of the anxiety or discouragement or stress that we feel in the moment is a tension between citizenships. And you might feel that you are away from home in your homeland. And if you feel like you are away from home in your homeland, then you are experiencing what the Apostle Peter describes as life as an elect exile. This is how he talks to the church in 1 Peter 1. He describes the church in 1 Peter 2 as beloved sojourners and exiles. Does this make sense to you? Because I can't see my notes and I can't see you. So anything affirmative that you can do for me will help me get through the next 30 minutes. If you feel that tension of life in exile, God has a word for you. And He has a word for me, and He has a word for us. And His word is simply this: we've been here before. And I remain in control. Follow me. And He says this word very clearly in the Old Testament book called Daniel. And it's timely for us to look at what God says about how to live faithfully when we discover that we've woken up in a place that doesn't feel as home like it used to. And then how can we find peace as we live in and wait for God's everlasting kingdom? So the agenda is to look at Daniel, and then we'll have Advent, Lord willing, and then back to Romans. But this morning, for wherever you hold on to that anxiety, if you hold on to that anxiety, and maybe I'm just preaching to myself, but wherever you hold on to that anxiety, I want you to hear from Daniel and from these first verses, and particularly verses 1 and 2, because the book of Daniel begins with a devastating report. Now, it begins with a note that really sounds like simple history. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And we know exactly what year that was. It's the year 605 BC. So we are not in the realm of myth or made-up story as the book of Daniel begins. We're at a moment in time. Jehoiakim is the king of God's people, of the part of the people known as Judah. And here is the Old Testament's assessment of Jehoiakim as a king. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. This is a bad report. This is not what you want at your annual review. That Jehoiakim did what was evil as his fathers had done before. So he's not just a one-off bad king. He's a bad king in a succession of bad kings. And behind that headline is this devastating report, because God had sent prophets over the years, really over centuries, to warn their people to not be like Jehoiakim and to turn away from the kinds of things that Jehoiakim and the other kings were leading them into. Because all the way back to the time of Moses, God had promised that if the nation wandered and continued to wander and didn't return, that exile would be the result. All the way back in Deuteronomy, God says to Israel, should they wander, these words, "You shall be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known." So centuries before the time of Jehoiakim, God said, look, if you keep going down this path and you don't turn, exile will happen. And now that the story of the Daniel begins, exile has happened. Prophets warned. Sometimes people had turned around. A century before Daniel, God had intervened dramatically to deliver the people from the Assyrians. In the time of the prophet Isaiah, we read this: "The angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians." Unilateral deliverance. The people were besieged. The people repented. The people prayed. The angel of the Lord showed up. There was a mighty deliverance. God created humans to live lives in relationship to Him of worship, love, and trust. Basic to the human dilemma is that sin rewires what we trust. God called His people, including Jehoiakim, including the people that Jehoiakim was king over, to live lives of God dependence, which would have a witnessing effect to the rest of the world. That the God of Israel saves. That the God who makes covenant with the people is the one who delivers them. And Jehoiakim, whose job as king was to keep his people going in the right direction, has taken his people in the wrong direction. And instead of trusting God, as he sees Babylon grow as a superpower, as he reads his news, as he looks on his Facebook and he says, "Oh, Babylon's growing. I need a plan to save the people." Instead of turning to God, what he does is he actually turns to Egypt, which was a bad idea for a couple of reasons. It was a bad idea just in terms of who to trust in terms of power, but it was also a bad idea theologically. Because what do you know about Egypt in the story of Israel? Egypt is where God saved his people from. It's where they had been enslaved. God had taken his people out of Egypt. He'd shown them through saving them that he loved them, that he saved them, that he was trustable. And when Jehoiakim, seeing the emergence of Babylon, turns back to Egypt, he's not just making a bad treaty deal, he's rejecting God. He's saying, we'd rather trust in the people that enslaved us than trust you. Zephaniah was a prophet. About 100 years before Daniel, he warned that Babylon was coming. Habakkuk was a prophet at the same time as Zephaniah. He struggled to understand that God might use a people like the Babylonians to discipline Judah. Enter King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of the world's superpower. And it's important that we keep that in mind, because some of us will have raised children on the VeggieTale cartoons, and you might think of Nebuchadnezzar as a cartoon cucumber. And the word Nebuchadnezzar might make you, the name Nebuchadnezzar might make you smile. He was a bad dude. He was the leader of the world superpower, economically dominant, militarily unstoppable, culturally sophisticated. he came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. What would it be like to wake up in Jerusalem and to look outside and see Babylon? What would you do? Well, you might have a prayer meeting. You might ask God to intervene, like he did 100 years earlier. You might ask him to do that thing that he did with the Assyrians. He did it before. Do it again, Lord. You might have had a prayer meeting like that. Whatever prayers were offered for deliverance, whether from genuine believers or from lip service fakers, whatever prayers were offered, that they were not answered. At least according to how the prayers would have prayed them. Because of verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. The angel of the Lord did not show up. The good guys did not win. If you were there, what kind of questions would you have had in that moment? What kind of questions would you have had? Why didn't God show up? Where was God? Why didn't he answer our prayer? What's wrong with us? Has he completely rejected us? Especially if you were a faithful believer, kind of caught up in that historical moment. I mean, you might have realized that Jehoiakim was not the real thing, but you were a genuine believer. And yet here comes Nebuchadnezzar. Have we been faithful to God for nothing? And then there would be go forward questions. What happens next? Should we keep living faithfully? How do we keep living faithfully? Daniel begins with a devastating report, and it includes a disorienting relocation. Nebuchadnezzar brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So Jerusalem and Babylon in the Bible are both real places and also symbolic realms. So Jerusalem, the first time that we hear of Jerusalem in the Bible is Genesis chapter 14. God has called Abraham to go to the land that God is going to take Abraham to. He is going to build a people through Abraham, through whom the world will be blessed. Abraham is on the way, and he bumps into a guy with that name that's impossible to pronounce, Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the king of Salem, Jerusalem, same city. He is the king of Salem, and Abraham, he blesses Abraham, and Abraham pays him a tithe. Jerusalem eventually becomes King David's capital city. His son, Solomon, builds the temple in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is, of course, a real city. We know that. But it's also symbolic of the realm of God and his people. Zion is one of the names that's used to describe it in the Old Testament. So Jerusalem is a real place and a symbol. So is Babylon. We actually meet Babylon earlier in the Bible than we meet Jerusalem. We meet Babylon in Genesis chapter 11. We read this. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain, catch this, in the land of Shinar, and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now, this is more than just a building project. This is a pride project. This is, let's make a tower to make a name for ourselves independent of God. This actually becomes a self-worship project. And it happens at Shinar. It happens in Babylon. Babylon, the superpower of Daniel's day, becomes symbolic for the realm of humanity living in rebellion against God. And we see that in the New Testament. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of real Babylon, and also representing symbolic Babylon, sacks God's temple and brings God's temple items back to Shinar. I wonder if you catch the lesson there. Do you see that? Nebuchadnezzar sacks the temple and he takes the stuff from Yahweh's temple and he brings it back to the place from which Yahweh scattered humanity. And it is an amazing turn of events. The place where God had judged prideful humanity centuries before, now Nebuchadnezzar puts God's holy items into his own unholy temple. I mean, you can imagine the promotional material. Yahweh, Israel's God, yeah, we've got his stuff. It's right in the temple next to the other stuff of the other gods. We're not so worried about Yahweh anymore. We're not so worried about a defeated God and his captured stuff. We've got his stuff. We've also got his people, the best and the brightest. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Next week, Patrick Tabano is going to look at this passage in depth. This week, simply see that the exile that had been on the horizon, that had been promised all the way back to Deuteronomy, that had been warned about by the prophets, now Daniel and his friends are experiencing it. They're living through it. How disorienting would this have been? Many of you are young adults here, teenagers, some of you. That's how old Daniel and his friends are as the story starts. They might be middle schoolers, they might be young high schoolers. These are young adults. This was not their dream. They did not want to go to Babylon U to learn the culture of their captors. What should they do? It veers very close to one of the questions that Christians are afraid to ask, I think. We ask it, but we're afraid to say it out loud. When crises like this come, is God treating me fairly? Has he let me down? Has it really all been for nothing when I experience injustice on account of or at the hand of another person? Has God let me down? God's city is sacked. His stuff is boxed up into an idol's temple. His king is captured. His people are being deported. Has God lost control? When was the last time you asked that question? Maybe in your personal life about a personal event. Maybe in your individual life about national events. Maybe as you look at some of the calamities that have recently touched our nation. Has God lost control? There is a truth in verse 2 that we need to surface. that beneath the disturbing report and beneath the disorienting relocation, there is a determining ruler at work. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Look at how verse 2 starts. I don't know if you're a Bible writer, underliner, but if you are, I would underline the word gave. Look at how verse 2 starts. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand. Think about that. Nebuchadnezzar marches up with the troops and sacks the cities and sacks the temple, and he carries off the king, and he carries off the stuff, and he carries off the people. And you think, look at this wonderful thing that I've done for Babylon. But beneath it, the Lord is at work. Beneath it, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand. God has not lost control of his people. And he's not lost control of history. He's not somehow been bumped into plan A, from plan A to plan B at this moment in time. The Lord gave. And when Daniel and his friends wake up in Babylon, and now they're facing decisions that they could never have imagined having to make, we come down to verse 9, and we read, "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the official." And then as they study for their exams to be accepted into the civil service of Babylon, to work for King Nebuchadnezzar, not the king that they would have aspired to work for when they were growing up in Jerusalem. We read in verse 17, "To these 4 men God gave knowledge." The Lord gave. God gave. God gave. A devastating report, a disorienting relocation, God gave. God gave. A city sacked, God gave. A temple ransacked, God gave. God still in control. We sometimes rehearse the catechism question, what are God's works of providence? God's works of providence are his most holy, wise, and powerful, preserving and governing all his creatures, the Nebuchadnezzars and the Daniels, ordering them and all their actions to his own glory. Here are 2 observations that I want us to leave with by way of application. As you think about the places where you feel anxiety and stress, and discouragement and distraction. First, God shows his control over human affairs to be so precise and so ordered for his glory that even the instances that seem to take glory from him, his temple items, in the idol's temple, just for example, the very things that seem to take glory from him, he is able to use for his glory, and he must. Because he cannot permit anything that will not ultimately tend to his glory. Because he's not in competition with the idols of Babylon. He is sovereign to them, and he is superior over them. And if Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he is having a moment, Yahweh is having an eternity. This is one of the great gifts of the book of Daniel for our time. That our challenges and our stresses and our disappointments that are unique to us because there are experiences, but are not unique to people in the passage of human history. And our wonderings about how to live faithfully in our moment, or our wonderings about whether or not God is in complete control, all occur in a world in which he must work for his own glory. So people ask me, Dave, how should I vote? I will tell you. Because I think you should vote if you're eligible to vote. And I will begin my answer by reminding you that God alone is Lord of the conscience and has left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word or beside it, if matters of faith or worship, so that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commands out of conscience is to betray true liberty of conscience. And the confession goes on from there, but the point simply is this: God alone is Lord of your conscience. But he speaks to your conscience through his word. That it's not you and your naked conscience as you go through life. It's you and your word-informed conscience. So if you're wondering how to vote, this is what I suggest that you do. This is what I would do. I would take my issue, and then I would read the Ten Commandments. Because that is God's moral law, which is revealed for the good of all mankind. And I would apply what God has said is true and enduring and also for the flourishing of human people to the issue. And then I would subsequently read the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus preaching on the moral law to his people. And when you get to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, what you will understand is that you are a sinner. And I am a sinner, because that's another thing that the moral law reveals. And so what I would do in doing that is the first thing that I would do, even before I consider about how to vote, is I would make sure that I am right with God, that I have trusted Jesus for my forgiveness, that I am building my house on the rock and not on the sand, which is how the Sermon on the Mount ends. And then, having informed my conscience by Scripture, I would vote. Because God alone is Lord of the conscience. And if the outcome that I hope for prevails, or if the outcome that I hope for does not prevail, what I would tell myself is that God is working all things for his glory. And the next thing I would tell myself is that God is trustable, because his involvement in history for his glory is also personal and relational. God remained intimately involved in every detail level of Daniel's life. And this is for next week, because I need to leave Patrick something to preach. He's going to be unhappy with me tomorrow. Loved ones, we are completely free to have no comprehension of what exactly God is doing, and at the same time, completely free to believe that he knows exactly what he's doing, because he is God and I am not. And he is doing all things for his glory, and he must. And so I don't have to be able to explain the end from the beginning. I just have to trust him with the beginning and the end. William Cooper wrote a great hymn about this very thing that we sometimes sing, God moves in mysterious ways. And here's how Cooper put it: blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. God is the interpreter of Jehoiakim's defeat. God is the interpreter of Daniel's exile. One of the beautiful things that we'll see in this book is that teenage Daniel cannot, from the vantage point of being a teenager, interpret all that God will do through him by the time that he reaches age 80. He cannot imagine that he will work in Babylon for different superpower leaders for almost 70 years, that against the backdrop of real disappointment, God is going to raise up Daniel to serve in the halls of power, that he will tell pagan kings about the real God. God is his own interpreter. And God is his own interpreter of our own national moment. So read your Bibles and study the issues. The Lord is Lord of your conscience, and let God interpret the moment, just as you let God interpret the moment of your job search, your surgery, your children's life before the Lord. He is his own interpreter. He will make it plain. But what about, Dave, and I realize that we're rapidly running out of time, what about the very dangerous question? Is God treating me fairly? It's not fair to state the dangerous question and then not answer it. Well, here Jehoiakim does one useful thing for us. And the useful thing that he does for us in his failure is show us a king from Judah who tried to save God's people by depending on himself, by depending on his own wisdom, his own treaty, the money he paid to Egypt. And through all of this, he failed. His failure is instructive because Jehoiakim, failed king of Judah, is not the end of the story. 605 years later, another man from Judah will be born. 605 years later, another king from Judah will be born in Bethlehem. And this man from Judah will announce that he is king of God's people as there had never been before. And this man from Judah, not unlike Daniel, but significantly more than Daniel, will within himself experience exile. He will within himself, if you will believe it, because he is God in the flesh, experience himself the temple looted. He will, in himself, at his trial, be besieged by pagans. And at the cross, he will be polluted and disgraced and discarded, and it will look like the idols won. And if you'd been there, you would have wondered, had God failed to show up? Had he failed to answer this man's prayers? And if you wondered, and if you waited but one night, 2 nights, a third morning, and if you happened into a graveyard, you might have heard 2 men say, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" He is not here. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. God is his own interpreter. Or as Cooper continues, judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Do you know how it continues? Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. Disturbing report, a disorienting relocation, a king who reigns. Do you believe it?